to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax. And today, Josh and I are going to discuss a question that we received via email a few days ago. And, as we were discussing this email, because we like to go over the emails that we get and come up with a sort of a united response to those. This one seemed really pertinent to probably a lot of players. And I think we haven't necessarily discussed some of what we want, some of what this prompted for us. It provoked, certainly for me, some thoughts that I think are really important in terms of becoming a better competitor at tennis. And I think that's going to be a big theme today is there's a huge difference between competitive skills and tennis skills. And we want to really differentiate between those. So I'm going to read the email and then I'll give just a summary of, I think, how we want to break this down a little bit. So here's the email. So I'm a 40-year-old club player who started playing about 2 years ago. I'm roughly a 3-5 player, was completely obsessed with playing, but I've hit a bit of a wall, largely due to my mental freakouts in matches. In searching for ways to get mentally tougher so I can keep improving and enjoying playing tennis, I came across your podcast, and in particular, episode 26. So episode 26 was the power of routines. Most of what you said regarding in-between point routines made sense, but I'm wondering if you have any tips on how to design something specifically for me, or if there's a menu of things to mix and match and try to see what does and doesn't work. I will say I've been incorporating more self-talk, but oftentimes I'm too focused on the perceived quality of my shot, in or out, than the result. If I lose a point due to what I feel was a really bad miss or lose a point I had under control, I have a hard time letting it go, and it derails me for a few points or even games. As I'm sure you can guess, if the errors compound, I basically beat myself. I really want to work on getting rid of my negative body language and developing a strong routine to project to my opponent and myself that I'm still focused and ready to take on the next point. Any additional guidance or resources you can send my way would be much appreciated. So I think, Josh, as we were talking about preparation, I think we want to break this episode down into maybe 2 or 3 parts. The first one is really reconceptualizing or reframing our mental model of what competitive tennis is. And I think even within the email, we see a little bit of, I think it's normal, as you grow into being a tennis player, a little less experience with competitive tennis, you see something that's fairly normal here where it's very focused on skills and ball quality. I think then we can also look at the his question with respect to designing a routine is great. You can obviously use the 16-second cure. We talked about that in episode 26, but we also want players to have autonomy, and I think we can certainly give a menu of things to consider, as well as, all right, how do you want to feel when you're coming out of that? And then I also have some suggestions for different episodes to go back to cover some of these topics, and we can go over some of that near the end of the episode, right? So just want to get your comments, Josh, on just the structure of today, and then I'm happy to kind of launch into the mental model of tennis.
Yeah. So thank you for the question. I think the question will bring about an interesting episode and some interesting different pieces here. But first, before we dive into this topic, we want to take a moment to mention our sponsor, Go Sport. So as a listener of the Tennis IQ podcast, you can get 10% off Go Sport products at gosport.com, GEAU sport.com, by using their discount code TennisIQ10. So you can visit gosport.com and be sure to check out their selection of premium gear bags for tennis and pickleball. Brian and I both use their bags, and they're fantastic. Again, you can use the discount code TennisIQ10 to get 10% off all products at gosport.com. So as we start to dive into this episode, I think that the way that you framed it is really important, right? Where we want to start really big picture, thinking about, can we reframe what competitive tennis really is in the first place, right? So instead of viewing it as sort of a collection of tennis skills, right? Okay, my serve is a 7.9 out of 10. My forehand is this out of 10. My backhand is this. My volley is this. And then how does that match up to my opponents? Um, can we reframe what tennis is and sort of be able to look at it in a different lens? And I think if we can view tennis as, as I think we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but really as a battle, right? As we've talked about tennis as sort of a combat sport without, obviously, we're not using our fists and our feet, right? As people do in other combat sports, but it is still a battle. And if we can focus on sort of those competitive skills that are required in a battle in terms of maybe problem solving and refocusing and resetting and identifying opponents' strengths and weaknesses and being able to capitalize on weaknesses from your opponent and being able to handle those inevitable ups and downs that will happen during a match, right? So if we can focus on some of these different competitive skills that really are required mentally, strategically, emotionally during a match, I think we instead of just viewing it as sort of a battle of of strokes and shots, right? If we can reframe it into more of a competition of who's better, who is more able to compete out there and use their competitive skills, I think I think we're more well suited. So I like the way that you are framing this, and I would say that for a lot of players, their sort of default state is just that, right? Is focusing maybe too much on results, having a tough time when their game isn't at their best, which obviously leads to frustration, which leads to challenge in terms of resetting. And I think if we're able to reframe tennis as maybe more of a battle and focus on those competition skills rather than too much of a focus on just tennis strokes, I think we can start to conceptualize it in a more helpful way and set players up with tools to handle some of these tough moments that they'll inevitably find themselves in.
So I want to set the stage for what I think a new mental model of tennis should be. You've touched on it a little bit, but I want to make sure we're super clear here. Number one, tennis is often trained as a skill sport primarily, but it's not. As you said, it's a fight. And because it's trained primarily as a skill sport, we get focused on the wrong things in matches. And this is, coaches can be to blame for this sometimes as well. So, and we see it in this email, ball quality, right? The quality of contact is something that is upsetting here. A quote unquote bad miss, or I'm in control of a point and I lose it. These are, it's understandable that we could become upset, but this is completely missing the point of competitive tennis. Because if you think those things are important on the scoreboard, then you don't understand the scoreboard. The scoreboard is to win 2 sets. Ball quality of contact, not a consideration. Whether you've made, we also don't classify unforced errors as good, bad, particularly egregious, embarrassing. Not important, right? 1 inch out, or 5 feet out, no difference. Lose the point. Being in control of a point is desirable. It's actually a good thing. But if you lose that point, you lose that point. And I think if we're focusing on the wrong things, like quality of contact or good shots, bad shots, errors, points, inevitably you're going to struggle here. But this is something that we all go through, and I'll go back, Josh, to episode 6 when we had Jorge Capestani on, and he talked about his model of tennis IQ. We've covered that in many episodes since, but this is where there was 3 levels. Level 1, you on the ball. That's kind of the beginner level. You're figuring tennis out. Level 2, your side of the court. And that's what this is. This is people focusing so much on themselves, their technique, etc., that they're missing the big picture, which is level 3, which is about the fight. This is about making your opponent uncomfortable. And of course, we beat ourselves because we are in our own head, judging ourselves for things that are not consequential on the scoreboard. The scoreboard does not care about how well you're playing. It does not care about how well you're striking the ball. The scoreboard just cares about how many sets you won. And how you got there oftentimes is very ugly. A document I will often share with players is The Winner's Creed by Bill Tim. Right? We had Coach Tim on one of our episodes. And one of his former players wrote an intro to that I thought was really pretty cool, where he said, don't worry about playing well. It's not as important as you think it is. And that's a really important point, because you may not be playing well. Your opponent may not be playing well. Okay? You got to deal with that. So when we think of tennis as a skills sport only, then we come off the court thinking, oh, I've got to work more on my forehand, or I've got to go back and hit serves. And again, sometimes coaches feed this. They'll look at a match and say, oh yeah, you double faulted X number of times. We got to go work on your technique and your serve. And again, that's missing the point too. Do we need to work on the serve? Yeah, but maybe you need to work on the serve under pressure, not just the technique, right? I don't know what percent of clients you get, Josh, that come to you and say, I play better in practice than in competition. For me, it's 90+%, right? That
Absolutely.
tells me, right? So that right there tells you don't need to really work on the technique. You need to work more on playing under pressure and understanding what are competitive skills. You were referring to that. So let me just give a few, and then I'll let you kind of jump in here, right? To me, competitive skills are about your ability to focus in the present moment, no matter what's going on, right? Focus on what you can control. That's one. Number 2, it's understanding what you are trying to win here. Points are a means to win games. Games are a means to win sets. We need to win 2 sets. Points don't mean nearly as much as you think they do. So you have to understand that. That's a competitive skill, to be able to play a bad point and come back and play a good point on the next one. Just put that aside. So the idea of letting go and resetting, our listener put that in there as something he wanted to work on. I think there's a level of discipline that goes on with your routine, your decision making, what you're doing on changeovers. That's super important. You're sticking with that. And throughout this whole thing, you're persevering, you're persisting, you are relentless in this fight to try to stay present throughout the whole match. If you can stay present for a really long time and the match gets tight, maybe in a third set, you give yourself a better chance of winning that, because you're not saddled with what has happened before. You're really right in the moment and you're ready for this particular point. And the last thing I'll say sort of about on the competitive skill side is that winning tennis matches, being a competitive player, is much more about your character as a person than it is about your forehand. This is where we're practicing being our best self. This is where we're practicing handling difficult things, handling challenges, staying focused, learning how to regulate our bodies such that we can relax and make good decisions, learning to regulate our bodies so we can be pumped up for the next point. Body language, self-talk, breathing. These are all key skills that help you compete better, right? If we could have more emphasis on those 3 things alone, Josh, forget about the quality of your strokes. You're going to play better and win more matches. So I'll stop there just to get kind of your perspective on reframing our mental model of tennis.
So I think, first of all, I think you said a lot of really important things there. I think that players intuitively understand a piece of this. I think if you ask, club players, about the best players in the world, right? If we think about on the men's side, the big three or big four, with Djokovic, Nadal, and Federer. Some include Murray in that grouping, and then we think about some of the best uh, women's players in recent history. Certainly the Williams sisters come to mind, and Sabalenka and Swiatek, and some of these players that have won the most majors in recent years. When we think about any of these top players, and obviously on the men's side, Sinner and Alcaraz would be at the top of that list as well, obviously. But when we think about any of these players, and when you ask club players about any of these top ATP and WTA players, yes, they mention their strokes, right? Their, Sinner's backhand and Alcaraz's drop shot and Alcaraz's forehand and, you know, and Iga's forehand, right? And obviously their strokes come up and their strokes are relevant. And no part of what Brian and I are talking about today or in any episode is to say that strokes don't matter and that you shouldn't work on improving your game physically in terms of your technique and things along those lines. But when we think about those top players in history and currently, you'll hear you'll hear people bring up their tenacity, their fighting spirit, their ability to come back from being behind, their ability to fight, uh, their ability to win when they're not at their best. And to me, these skills are, first of all, their ability to do that is proof of exactly what we're talking about. But I think people intuitively get that if they can dig a little bit deeper. So I think that, again, we could think about Sinner being down, in Wimbledon, right? There was a match against Dimitrov. He was down 2-0, right? And maybe he was a little bit fortunate when Dimitrov had his injury, and Dimitrov's his bad luck was Sinner's good luck in that situation, but he managed to get through that match and win the tournament, right? We think about Alcaraz. He was down 2-0 and then 2-1 and a break and love 40 with really his back to the wall and managed to find a way, right? I mean, we can think about all of these top players in history on the men's and women's side, and currently the top couple of players, and they all, to me, are among the best at exactly what we're talking about, at finding a way, at these competitive skills, at problem solving, at winning when they're not at their best. Nobody, including these best players in the world, plays their best every single day, right? We did an episode on Roger Federer's commencement speech that he did at Dartmouth, right? He is widely considered among the best of all time. And he talked about in this commencement speech how over the course of his career, over 1,000 matches, he won 54% of his points. So to me, when a statistic like that comes up, and you talk about this with a junior player, you talk about this with a 3-0 or 3-5 or 4-0 or whatever level club player, it becomes a lot more clear that, okay, if Roger Federer is not going to be perfect, if Federer is not winning the vast majority of his points, and he's actually winning 54% of his points, and so is, Sinner and Alcaraz and Sabalenka and Coco and Iga, right? If they're winning maybe 54, 55% of their points, okay, maybe they're not, perfect out there either, right? Maybe what they actually do best is they find a way. They find a way to win those maybe certain points that they really need to win in terms of bigger points, but they're able to problem solve. They're able to figure things out when they're not at their best. They're able to win ugly. To me, one of the biggest differences between someone who's, let's say, top 5 in the world and someone who's maybe top 50 or top 100 is that ability to find a way on those days when they're not at their best more often. Again, not every time, but more often than somebody who's ranked a bit lower. So again, I think players, club players understand this, right? That they look at the pros, they understand that the best in the world are a big reason why they're the best is because they find a way. It's because they win uglies, because they problem solve. So I think players to some level intuitively understand this. I think what people need to do is to break out of that sort of default framing of I need to play well in order to win, right? And yes, it's great when we're playing well. Things certainly become easier, absolutely. But I think first of all, I think there's a certain satisfaction to being able to win on those days where you're not at your best because you found a way. So that's, first of all. But number two, like, again, if we can reframe and understand that a large percentage of the time, we're not going to be at our best, right? Some percentage of the time, we're going to be playing amazing. Some percentage of the time, we're going to be playing horrible. And then there's that remaining percentage, right? Maybe that's 70% of the time where we're sort of in that middle stage. And again, we want to make sure that we're trying to do things physically in terms of our technique that we're trying to focus on. But if that becomes too much of our focus, then we completely lose sight of these other skills, these competitive skills that I think whether it's at Wimbledon or whether it's in a league match or a local tournament can really become the difference maker between, who ends up finding a way and winning and who doesn't.
In episode 110, we talked about tennis as a fighting sport. And we drew inspiration from Sam Sheridan's book, The Fighter's Mind, which is a compilation of his interviews with fighters from various disciplines around the world. So wrestling, MMA, jiu-jitsu, etc. And a couple of the people featured in that book, both of whom actually came from wrestling backgrounds. One became a superstar in MMA, Randy Couture. The other, Dan Gable, one of the most amazing wrestlers of all time, but also became a celebrated coach, won several national championships, I think like 15 or 16, 20-something Big Ten conference titles at the University of Iowa. Both of them mentioned the primary goal of a fight is to break your opponent mentally. That is, when you step out on the court, the goal. How do you do that? You do that by making your opponent physically, mentally, emotionally uncomfortable. So this is where, if we come back to Jorge Capestany and his 3 levels of tennis IQ, this is level 3. This is us thinking about the other side. And all right, what does this person like? What do they not like? How can I keep the ball out of their strike zone so that he or she cannot make great contact? How do I maybe move them around if their movement is not part of their, one of their strengths, or their conditioning isn't so great? You have to understand the other side of the net to know what to do with your skills. And then you apply those skills to the weak parts of your opponent's game. And if you do that long enough, especially at, say a 3-0, 3-5, even a 4-0 level, you do that long enough, they will get to the point where they'll start losing the match for you. You will start to break them mentally. You'll see their body language get negative. You'll see or hear their self-talk. You'll see them rushing. You'll see them making bad decisions, trying to end points quickly. This is your goal. Your goal is not to just have quality contact all the time, look great, hit winners. All those things are nice, and they're part of the package. The primary goal is to make your opponent so uncomfortable that he or she breaks mentally. And I think we might have even mentioned this in that episode. That sounds a bit mean, a little bit cruel, but it's going to happen anyway. This is just you adding that intention, right? So this is the reframing. This is how we have to see tennis as a fight. Changing the mental model. It's not all about us. It is about this fight and breaking the opponent mentally, emotionally. So when we have that in mind, I think now we can talk a little bit, Josh, about what needs to be in the routine such that I can stay focused on this new primary goal. Um, I'm gonna I do have like a menu of things that I give players, right? So very often when I'm working with a player, we'll start with the 16-second cure because it's a good foundational base of something. The
Me
US,
too. Me
right.
too. Yep.
Yeah, and USTA player development has something extremely similar to it. I think they call it the 4 Rs. So it's still really the gold standard, more or less. I think, if anything, we've branched off to create more of a green light, yellow light aspect to it. But 16-second cure, great place to start. And when we do begin with that, the whole idea is to begin with it very sort of procedurally and mechanically. Treat that as a skill. I don't care what else is going on. Do this every time, right? But then after they get some experience with that, then we'll come back and we'll say, all right, now that you've had some experience with that, let's start to create one that you want to design that, incorporates a little bit more of who you are. So here are some things that I ask people to consider when they're building their own. Of course, their body language and their presence should be a part of it. So speak to that. You have to call that out. What does that look like? And this is the next one is certainly applicable to our listener. Having some sort of reset button ritual, letting it go ritual. Most of us need that. And it should be physical plus self-talk, maybe your coach's voice, right? There needs to be some inclusion of what you're doing with your breathing and relaxation, especially right after the point. There should also be some inclusion of what you're looking at, your visual gaze, right? What people can get looking at other courts or looking at their parents or people in the window, whatever. That has to be there, right? We want to make sure our eyes are focused on the court, and because we tend to focus on what we see. We should have some inclusion of our self-talk, our coach's voice. What are we saying? Do we have scripts? Maybe we need to create scripts for that. What's our intensity like? As we get prepared for the next point, we're getting kind of pumped up. Visualization could be a part of it. Not everybody does that, but it might be part of what you do, part of mentally rehearsing. Preparing for and planning that point, having a play, having an intention. And this, Josh, I think is really the key when we look at the making the opponent uncomfortable. You can't just make the opponent uncomfortable by winging it. You got to have some intention here about what am I going to do on this point, so that I keep the pressure on this person. And then we also want to make sure we're covering what your serve and return rituals are, so that at the end of your routine, you're getting yourself in a good space, you're comfortable, you're relaxed, and you're ready to just go. And so through some of those items, then you can start to put it into a sequence of, here is what I would like to do. And then you add your particular flavors to body language, the letting go, reset ritual, to what you're saying. Right now you're making it your own. And then you can begin to practice that. So I'll stop there, Josh, and get your thoughts on having a menu for the routine.
Yeah. I think that the 16-second cure, and, we're not going to dive into the different pieces of that. We have talked about it in the past. I think that episode that I think it was episode 26, where we sort of talked more about routines would be a great place to start if people are more interested in that. So you could certainly go back to that episode, and there's all, if you want to look up the 16-second cure and the work of Dr. Jim Lear. And again, as you said, USTA player development has their own recommendations that seem to be pretty closely linked to that as well in terms of their 4 Rs.
And the video for the 16-second cure is available on YouTube, so anybody can see that.
Yeah, and definitely a classic tennis sports psychology video. And I find that by introducing it to players, it gives people something to latch onto, right? Instead of sort of that default of carrying the energy and frustration from that last point, bringing it into the next point, not fully putting that last point behind them. It gives them some sort of way to process the last point, put it behind you, and then focus on the next point. And I generally focus on sort of those first three steps of it, and even think of it in terms of like past, present, future, where it's sort of in the beginning we're putting whatever happened in that last point behind us, then we're resetting, and resetting, coming back to the present, and then we're focusing on the future. And that really, to me, is the goal, where we're, whatever the score is, whatever happened in that last point, however we're playing in that particular moment and on that particular day, it's ultimately irrelevant because it's already happened. And what we need to do is we need to put it behind us. We need to ground ourselves and be present in this moment so that we can focus on the next point and have a clear plan for that next point. And again, the 16-second cure goes through those different steps. So I think that, I generally bring it up and go over it with people. And I think for a lot of athletes, they really like it. They feel like, okay, this is a nice structure. This is something I can go to, especially after I've sort of gotten over that hump of learning it, remembering it, using it to a point where sort of it's their own and they can, use it consistently. I think, for a lot of people do latch onto it. But what I think can be helpful, and which is what you're bringing up as well, is that it doesn't need to be necessarily. And again, if somebody likes using the 16-second cure and they like using it sort of step by step in that way, and that works for you, stick with it. I don't think you necessarily need to make any changes. But what I think is what Brian's bringing up, which I think is important, is that, what makes the 16-second cure effective, and, really what makes a solid in between point routine effective in general, is that it has some of these key elements, that it has sort of that menu of these different pieces of body language, of solid body language, of solid self-talk, of having a plan for the next point, right? Of having some of these different pieces. So it doesn't necessarily mean that a player needs to follow it to a T, and do every last piece of it, but that over time they can learn to just incorporate some of these different important pieces between points so that, that you're able to reset, refocus, and be ready for that next point. And I think all of those pieces are really important. So I think it depends. I think for some people, having that really specific structure of that routine and something to follow is helpful. And for other people, having a little bit more flexibility built in, and sort of making that routine their own over time and figuring out what works well for them, and maybe incorporating certain pieces into that routine that they've used in the past and like to use, can all be really helpful.
And when we do look at the pros, and we have to realize that they're much more experienced at this stuff than your average club player. There are differences. Some players take a long time. Nadal was historically taking a long time and pretty structured. Where, say, a Federer would oftentimes play a little faster, but he would definitely slow things down when he needed to. And so they had enough experience to know what they wanted to do in certain situations. And I think, what we're suggesting here is you got to get your feet wet with starting with a base, go with that, understand the point of the routine. To me, the real point of it is to make sure you're completely ready and invested in that next point. And if you're not, then you need to take more time. And then, circle back, whatever, because we get 25 seconds here. If you're only taking 10 and you're getting up to the line and you're still thinking about the past or you're thinking about the future, then you need to take more time so that you can get yourself completely ready. For anybody who's, in the United States or Canada, you're familiar with American football or Canadian football, teams huddle up, they talk. They don't just go up to the line with no plan whatsoever, and they're ready after that. So take the time that you need. So Josh, I wanted to suggest some episodes that people could go back to get a little bit more detail on some of these things that we're discussing. So I mentioned episode 6, Jorge Capestany and the tennis IQ model, those 3 levels. And it's great to hear him talk about that. But we mentioned that in terms of tennis as a fight. So that's another one, episode 110. tennis is a fighting sport. Super important, right, in terms of reconceptualizing your mental model of what we're trying to do here. Episode 152 could be interesting, Josh. We talked about venting anger and how we looked at a study. Does venting anger work? No, it doesn't. So there might be some useful information in that. Episode 156, I think, could be an important one. Increasing our tolerance of discomfort, not only physically, but emotionally. So this could help with having the expectation that this will be uncomfortable. I probably will be experiencing difficult emotions. Can I be okay with that? Can I build this tolerance? Can I build some emotional stamina? And then finally, we did an episode on self-talk and irrational beliefs, episode 183. So that could be very helpful. I think we get more into the coach's voice with that episode and how to transition from sort of the irrational, uncontrollable thoughts of judging yourself after every point and getting more toward good coaching advice. So I think there are a lot of episodes to go back to in terms of helping one reframe tennis, but also put together a very functional between point routine for you.
Absolutely. And I think one thing, and I know you've mentioned this in the past, and I've actually, I think brought it up as well. But a way to I think recognize the importance of the next point in maybe a different way that I know you've brought up in the past is we want to treat the next point as the most important point of the match because it's the only point that we have any control over. We have no control over anything that's happened in the past. We have no control over what, future points after, this upcoming one. There's nothing we can do about those right now, at least. What we can control is how we approach the next point. So if we're able to treat it with the seriousness that it deserves and treat it as the most important point of the match and put all of our focus and attention towards it, regardless of what the score is, regardless of how we're playing. We might be playing horribly on that particular day. We might be getting crushed, whatever. If we can approach that next point with the seriousness and attention that it deserves, and then do it again for the following point, and then do it again for the following point, that's us truly playing one point at a time. That's us controlling what we can in that situation, right? We, again, can't control what's happened at that point. We can't control that we're down 6-0, 5-0. We can control how we approach that next point. And then that one after that, and then that one after that. And I think by sort of taking that approach, by taking it one point at a time, by controlling what we can and putting our focus towards something that actually we can impact in that moment, we give ourselves the best possible chance, but we're also getting into that sort of new way of thinking, right? That, that focus on being the best competitor that we can be, that focus on prioritizing those competitive skills over just their tennis skills, right? Our forehand and our backhand and our volley and serve and et cetera are going to be at the level on that particular day that they are. Maybe there's some things that we can do to adjust it and make some changes, but in general, they're going to be more fixed on a particular day. But I think by committing to some of these skills that we're talking about in terms of focus, in terms of resetting, in terms of problem solving, et cetera, we give ourselves the best fighting chance. And we are, we're getting into that mode of sort of tennis being a battle. And with whatever we happen to have on that particular day, we're doing our best to try to maximize that and try to use whatever that is and try to find a way to crack the opponent mentally and physically.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think for me in my own growth as a player, realizing that the most important point of the match is always the next one, it made me reflect on my own performances in the past and understand that I didn't treat matches that way. I very often was treating past points as the most important points in a match. And of course, I can't change those. So I'm spending a lot of focus energy on something I can't change. And I kind of got a little disappointed in myself. Like I've been missing the point all these years that I was basically stepping off the court saying, yeah, most of the time I was not focused on the most important point of the match. And that's not anything we want to say at the end of a match. So no one's going to be 100% at this, but could you raise the percentage of points in which you are focused on that next point? Could you go from 50 to 60 to 70 to 80? If you can simply increase that number and feel more ready for every single point, it will have an impact on your game for sure. And so that might be something that people want to keep themselves accountable for. Is, we talked, I don't remember the episode, I didn't note this one, Josh, but we did something about a mental scorecard. Maybe part of your mental scorecard is, did I do my best to be 100% focused on the next point, right? Or what percentage of points was I focused on the most important point of the match? Can we get that higher? So I think this is some good stuff, and I really appreciate the listeners sending us this question because it really highlighted a lot of things that we can cover that if people can reconceptualize how they see tennis, more so as a fight rather than a skills game, you will compete better. And then if you can see how the between point routine enables you to go from point to point in that fight and to persevere, again, you will compete better, regardless of the quality of your shots.
Absolutely. And that, I just looked it up. That episode is 179 about the mental scorecard, which is something that I think Brian and I both recommend players trying to use and incorporate. And I think, getting away from this is just a skills competition, right? It's not, something like figure skating where it's like, okay, these are my skills. Let's put it out there. I'm going to get a grade for each skill. It really is much more of a combat sport where we're trying to find a way and we're trying to battle against an opponent. And I think the last point that I'll say here, and I you talked about, it's not about trying to be perfect, right? Maybe we can raise the level, raise the frequency of us using that solid routine between points, of us being fully ready for that next point, right? If we can go from 50 to 60 to 70, right? If we can get up to, let's say, the 80s or the 90s, right? If we can do that and we're more ready, we're ready for that next point, we're treating that next point as the most important point of the match more often, guess what? That we set ourselves up better to ultimately be more successful out there. And as we talked about with Roger Federer winning 54% of points and the top ATP and WTA players pretty much almost never over the course of a season winning over 55, 56% of points, the margins out here are really slim. If you can manage to be ready to go for that next point 5% more often, 10% more often, that leads to you winning a few more points, a handful of more points. That means you're more ready for those ups and downs. That means you're more present. That means your emotions will be more collected. And again, since margins are so slim out here, those few points that go in your direction rather than your opponent's can be the difference maker. So I think the key, again, is not perfection. The key is being able to maximize on how slim those margins are by giving ourselves the best possible chance in that upcoming point, by, again, using a routine and sort of reframing how we conceptually think about this sport, which can lead to us, really trying to, find a way and treat it maybe a little bit more of a battle.
So again, thanks to our listener for sending in that question, and certainly encourage other listeners to send us questions because they often provide great episode ideas. That's our show for today. Thank you all for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you do have any feedback or questions for the two of us, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the content that Josh and I discuss on the show, please rate and review the podcast so other tennis enthusiasts can find it more easily. Additionally, to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube. And you can also check us out on Instagram. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.